Welcome back. I'm Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you by SaltWire. And a lot happens with government business. We know the spring sitting of the legislature was fairly short. It wrapped up. But the work of committees continues year-round. In fact, there was a committee meeting this morning, the Standing Committee on Human Resources. And, quite an interesting subject to take on. Impacts of low wages on labor shortages, as well as this conversation involving several people, including deputy ministers and the employer side of things. Collette Robert was there to bring a perspective of the worker to this conversation. She's a volunteer with the Minimum Wage Committee here in Nova Scotia, and she joins me now. Collette, it's so nice to see you. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
And you're currently working a part-time minimum wage job, or is it a full-time job?
I'm working 2 part-time jobs. One's minimum wage and one isn't much beyond that, and they're both inconsistent hours, so part-time, yeah.
And you were invited. Do you know who invited you, or did you offer to stand before this committee or sit before this committee?
I was invited, but it's my understanding that a representative from the Minimum Wage Review Committee always attends. So in this stance, it could have been either me or Danny, who has attended in previous years, and so this year it was me. I was invited.
Okay. Now, we know earlier this year, the committee that was reviewing minimum wage said, you know what, we need to get to $15 an hour much quicker than what previous recommendations were. So what can you tell me about the way that was presented to government? Because I did hear a comment that, really balancing employer-employee interests when it comes to these conversations.
Absolutely, yeah. So as the Minimum Wage Review Committee stands right now, there's 2 employee representatives, I would be one of them, and 2 employer representatives. And so it's that balancing act of, are people paid enough to live realistically? Or it's, looking at the other perspective of, we could increase the minimum wage to be closer to a livable wage, but can businesses afford to do that? It's definitely a balancing act.
So can we talk about how that conversation went? As you say, maybe $22 would be a much more affordable wage for people to be able to pay their bills, find a place to live, all of the things, all those challenges that we saw over the last several years. Really, we saw them intensify. So what can you say about that conversation, about a huge increase in the pressures that may or may not put on employers?
Absolutely. Well, in the past, and for anyone interested, you can Google Minimum Wage Review Committee report, and it will pop up over the years, the report and kind of how we came to the decisions that we did. In this past year in particular, and this was mentioned in the meeting we had this morning, normally the minimum wage is calculated by CPI plus 1%. However, in negotiations with the employee and the employer representatives, we came to an agreement that over this past year, we would increase it a bit faster, recognizing, inflation, cost of goods and services, our housing crisis, that's just to name a few. And so normally you'd only see one increase in minimum wage per year, and it would be calculated by the CPI plus 1%. However, we saw 2 increases this year, one in April and another scheduled for October. And by the time we reach October, it'll be up to $15. And so normally it wouldn't increase that aggressively, but I would say, the employer representatives were pretty open-minded and understanding of the hardships that people were facing. And so they agreed to let it increase a bit more aggressively this time around. Yeah.
And you mentioned CPI, Consumer Price Index. I'm just looking here that the average for 2022 was around 6.8%. Plus that 1%. That's what you're saying. That would be, where would a 7% hike have taken us?
Great question. I don't have the numbers offhand, but I do know it would have been less than the increase that we did put in place.
And a lot of folks would say, well, why not just put it to $16? That seems like it would be better, but still not enough.
Exactly. Of course, that would be ideal for a lot of the people that are working for minimum wage. It would make quite a difference in their lives. But the reality is that there are a significant amount of businesses and organizations that would be forced to shut down because they couldn't afford the labor costs associated with increasing the wages. And we don't want that to happen. So.
And the other part of that equation is, what happens to the people who were making $15 an hour now? Does the recommendation say everybody should get a bump?
No, but I would say, in an ideal, I don't want to say ethical organization, but to keep their employees happy, you typically see a bump in their pay as well. That's pretty similar to what the minimum wage increase would have been.
Do you find people have a good grasp of the complexity or the intricacies of these conversations when it comes to the mandate that's set out for a volunteer agency or board like yours?
No. And I had no idea signing up for it about 6 years ago. Just, the amount of work and the complexity of all of the different ways that minimum wage can be calculated, and, how every province is different, and the populations that you're serving, and the jobs at play. There's a lot to consider, and the impact it has on our economy, positive or negative, with our small businesses trying to keep up, but also our people being able to have a livable wage and afford everything that they need. It's a struggle for sure.
There are some huge estimates about what the volunteer economy does for our society. That, to put a dollar figure on that, you mentioned you do volunteer in several different places. Why? Why do you volunteer?
Well, it started out when I was in high school. It was encouraged, to build your resume to get a good job eventually. And back then I also wanted to go to medical school. So I thought, getting in as many volunteer hours as possible is probably a good thing. And then I realized kind of throughout university that it's often these volunteer positions that help you get into a position where your opinion is valued and you can have an impact and change the system that we live in. So really that's what drives me today, is being able to have my voice heard and hopefully contribute to that change.
There's a lot going on right now with inflation, food inflation, the housing crisis, a lot converging at one point in time. Was there ever any consideration to give something back to the people who volunteer? I know that's not necessarily why people volunteer, but, to somehow account for this, to try and help. Because I'll be blunt, the volunteer base is shrinking because people don't have time, because they may be working 1, 2, or 3 part-time jobs on top of every other thing that they have going on in their lives. So I'm just wondering if that has ever come up as a possible way of looking at it a little differently.
Absolutely. I think that has been looked at before. And for example, I sit on the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women, and we are paid a daily honorarium. So not all committees, councils, that kind of thing are volunteer. However, for a lot of the ones that are paid, the rate was set in, I think, the 1970s. So it hasn't come up to speed with our day-to-day costs. And it's really inaccessible for people that need, for example, if there's going to be meetings all day, to take the day off of work, especially if they're working minimum wage and they're relying on every dollar to go and sit through these meetings. So it's definitely inaccessible for a lot of people. And I do find I'm often one of the youngest people at the table when I'm on these committees. And I think that that's an accessibility issue because the younger people can't afford to be there. And I'm not saying that I can necessarily. It's a sacrifice, but there could definitely be other ways to help volunteers if it's possible, but I could see that being a deterrent for some people volunteering.
We have a labor shortage. That was part of the reason for this committee's meeting today, to talk about what the connection is. Is there a correlation between the minimum wage and the availability of workers?
Ava did mention that in terms of labor shortages, that this year it's actually not as bad as it has been previous years. However, I think jobs that are offering more incentives, increasing the hourly pay being one of them, health benefits could be another, paid sick leave, those types of things are definitely things that would entice people to work for those organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, well, to your point, I'm seeing on signs at fast food restaurants now hiring $15 an hour. They weren't waiting for the government's minimum wage threshold to kick in. So what does that tell you about the market?
It's quite competitive, searching for employees. And if people are able to pay them above minimum wage, I would say a lot of them are really trying to do it and come out competitively because they're able to offer those wages. So absolutely, you see, other small businesses and other people suffering. They can't get their staff because other places like McDonald's, a big player, comes in and offers them $15 an hour plus benefits. It's quite unfortunate, yeah.
Well, there's this ceiling. It's like you're not necessarily going to get much above that unless you move into a management position or something else outside of. But just to find a job that pays enough to pay the bills, it sounds like that's for those of us who are lucky enough to be in that position. We're lucky enough to be in that position. It's not available to everyone.
Exactly, and as we get older, a lot of people have, let's just say, a 2-income household. I mean, maybe they also have children and other expenses too, but people could be in privileged positions if they are able to share their expenses and that type of thing. But if you look at someone who is single, living on their own, and they're expected to pay for all of their life's expenses, and single parents, and then there's also the issue of childcare and if that's accessible or not, and to still work at the same time. Yeah, it gets pretty complex.
What was your message to the standing committee, and do you feel you delivered it? Did they hear you?
I would say that the committee was very receptive. The main points I basically said were that the minimum wage is not a livable wage, and that we could look at solutions such as the government offering a wage subsidy for those businesses that couldn't afford the minimum wage increase. So if the businesses demonstrated some kind of hardship, if we were to increase the minimum wage, that the government would step in and help them out and help with the wage costs. I'd say that would be the main take home, and also to look closer at Nova Scotians' take home pay and how much they're being taxed. And now I know we tax in other ways like goods and services, but the actual take-home pay that Nova Scotians have, especially if they're only making minimum wage, isn't that much. And so how can we look at putting more money into the pockets of Nova Scotians at the end of the day?
And it's come up often to increase that threshold for the basic personal deduction to get people to a point who aren't making a living wage to the point where they're not paying some of that shortfall in taxes.
Exactly.
So just a quick question: Why government help? Why put a recommendation forward for government to help employers as opposed to the employee? Why look at it that way?
Because the solution would be, to help employees, but also looking at the employer perspective, not shutting that out. So trying to have like a holistic view, and if we want to help employees get more money into their pockets, increase the wages, we don't want that to be detrimental to the employer's perspective and have more businesses be forced to shut down. As we've seen that trend ever since the pandemic, a lot have been forced to close their doors, and we don't want that wage increase to be another burden. So if there could be some kind of wage subsidy from the government to help out with those businesses. But at the end of the day, it is benefiting the employee if the wage increases. So I was trying to offer a solution kind of for both sides in that sense. But
as someone who's grown up in Nova Scotia, who's attended university, who has been working at trying to better their life, and you find yourself with this audience of people who are members of the Legislative Assembly, folks who have made their careers, who perhaps have entered politics, and then you step into the arena. Do you have any ambitions of politics or involving yourself in that way with your life and the work that you're doing?
I've thought about it. I know you and I had met, quite a few years ago when I was chair of Students Nova Scotia and representing the majority of students in the province. Politics has always appealed to me in the sense that, it's the policies that shape our society, and that's how you make the change type of thing. Although I also get the negative side of politics and quality of life around them, and I'm deeply empathetic towards the people that put their private lives essentially on the public scene every day and the long hours that they work. So maybe politics is in the cards for me someday, but there's a lot to consider there.
And a lot of life to live. Colette Robert, thank you for this. Employee representative, minimum wage committee, but as well someone who's invested in her community and her life. So I thank you for taking some time to share a little bit more with us about that process of what happened today with Nova Scotia's government.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Sheldon. And yeah, it was great to chat with you as always.